Testing 1, 2, 3.
A very good afternoon to distinguished guests, friends of the Institute, and also friends from Universiti Sains Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's special talk with a title, Down on the Waterfront, a reflective history of carbon, globalizations, and ecology in Penang. First of all, I would like to grab this opportunity to thank the main organizer, Penang Institute, PI, especially the Executive Director, Dr. Ng Bing, and Director of Research, Dr. Tan Lee Wei, MEE, and the team. Thanks for your works to make this talk a success. Secondly, I would like to thank you as well to Universiti Sains Malaysia, especially to School of Humanities and History sections, starting with the Dean of School of Humanities, Associate Professor Dr. Justin Sulung, and the chairpersons, Dr. Azmi Arifin, and my colleagues at History section and also others section as well. Before I start to introduce our speaker, just want to remind about our housekeeping rule. Please switch your mobile phone to silent mode during the talk. Okay, first of all, beside me is Professor David Biggs. And who is Professor David Biggs? Okay, David Biggs is a professor of Southeast Asian and Environmental History at the University of California, Riverside, UCR, and the 2024 Fulbright Scholar at Universiti Sains Malaysia, USM. His research explores environmental history and technopolitics in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. His first book, Quagmire, Nation Building and Nature in the Mekong Delta by University of Washington, 2011, is a classic book. You need to read it. Explore history intersections of politics and nature on the waterways of the Mekong Delta. His second book, Footprints of War, Militarized Landscape in Vietnam, 2018, is now available as an open access book. So you can access online to read the second book by Prof. David Biggs. Okay, for this book, it examines a long-term social and environmental history of military conflict in Vietnam. Biggs is a frequent collaborator on projects involving the use of Geography Information System, GIS, to study land cover change and toxic legacies at former military sites, and his work has appeared in numerous journals, the New York Times, and local venues. His work as a visiting assistant professor at Harvard University 2009, a Fulbright Scholar in Vietnam 2011, and NEH Fellow 2013, and a Rachel Carson Fellow at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich 2017, and currently a Fulbright Scholar at University Sains Malaysia as well. For more info, you can refer to his website, https davidbiggs.net, davidbiggs.net, and some additional info. Prof. David Biggs is a very, dedicated scholar. I really learned a lot from him. He's a scholar, he's a friend, he's a mentor. I learned work-life balance from him, and also learned something very special in history, the carbon, the energy, the environmental, which, because my field is more focused on politics and also about culture. But from David, I learned a lot. A guidance, a mentor from him. So, and his topic is quite interesting. I think this topic is uncommon because usually we have heard about history of politics, history of nation, history of culture, but very seldom heard about history of environmental in Penang, about carbon. So later, you will go through and you will explore together with Prof. David Biggs a very exciting and very unusual history of environmental in Penang. So the topic, Down the Waterfront, a reflective history of carbon, globalization, and ecology in Penang. What is it about? Okay, there's a very small abstract about this talk. Okay, referring to the abstract, for more than a century, the majority of works on Southeast Asia's modern history have grappled with the problem of the nation state. Just I mentioned nation state. Okay, from origins to possible futures, from Hang Tuah to Ho Chi Minh, nationalist and anti-colonial themes appear in most work. Since the rise of regional and global history in the 1950s, however, Southeast Asian historians have looked to the region's connection, material, commercial, religious, and ecological, to describe shared regional history. In our present era of climate change and accelerating globalization, historians have a special task to explore and record this shared regional and global past. Urban waterfronts like Penang offer a unique window onto this history, as they were important nodes for global trade, migrations, and the incredible flows of energy, biofuels, coal, petroleum, and electricity needed to fuel these activities. This talk draws on the concept of carbon flow, a brand new concept. Later we'll see how the carbon flows and how it shaped the history. As a lens, the production, consumption, and geography of energy, as a lens for examining Penang's waterfront history and locating it within a shared regional and global past. Part of a larger Southeast Asian Waterfronts Project, this talk will share preliminary reflections on Penang's waterfront history coming from Professor Big Richard as a 2024 Fulbright Scholar in the History section, School of Humanities at Universiti Sains Malaysia, as well as at Penang Institute in Penang. So we will now later embark into a very different journey on the Penang history on carbon flow. You never heard before, and maybe the first time. And let us give a big applause to our speaker, Prof. David Biggs from UCL and USM.
Thank you very much, Chi Sing. I think that's probably the best introduction I've ever received and that I will ever receive. Are you available for weddings or other events? I mean, he's incredible. It's so nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. I'll give some formal acknowledgements at the end of my talk, but I want to also acknowledge Ichie and the library here at Penang Institute, one of the places that I worked, Fatih, who took me on a mangrove trip. He's a student at USM, a graduate student, and that's where that picture came from. So it's wonderful to see you at my talk and in person. You had to drive here and everything. So thank you very much. Thanks to the Penang Institute. Thanks to the Universiti Sains Malaysia, the Humanities College, and the History section in particular for supporting me. For those of you who don't know, the Fulbright program's been around for about 70 years. It's an exchange program between the United States and other countries. And if you're interested in going in some capacity as a scholar or as a specialist, please email me and let me know. I've worked with students from different countries, mostly Southeast Asia, as well as scholars. I've hosted scholars at my university. And I want to give my biggest thanks to Chi Sing for the last 6 months for hosting me and working out so much paperwork, visas, arrangements, introductions at the Penang Institute, at the National Archives, getting to know this city, which I have completely fallen in love with. And it's such a fascinating place for stories. And so I really appreciate it. And this talk is really a reflection of all of that. And I hope I can deliver. So I'll keep my talk to 45 minutes. I think people get tired of speakers after that. So, but what I'd like to share today are my preliminary comments, and I'm really open and welcoming your suggestions as I go through. And I'll say that first of all, you know, we hear this term carbon politics, and we hear it referring to climate change, how much carbon dioxide's in the atmosphere, how much coal is getting pulled out of the ground. But we never really think about it historically. carbon politics. And I'm really interested in thinking about the future of cities in Southeast Asia, but also by looking at their environmental past to understand, in a sense, how these cities are built out of carbon, just like all cities in the modern era. So that's, in a sense, where this talk comes from. But my main area of specialization is in Vietnam, and I've worked there over 25 years. And the city that I've worked in, and I know like my second home, is Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City. And part of my purpose in this Fulbright was really to find another place in Southeast Asia with different dynamics, with a different colonial past, with some of the same issues development-wise, and some transnational connections that are very important in terms of trade, especially in the energy economy. So what follows today are preliminary comments, but I'm going to try to tell you a story. And if parts of the story make no sense to you, or if I've got it completely wrong, please let you know. And I'm also going to share the area of the city I'm most fascinated with. And it's not exactly Georgetown, it's the industrial zone to the south of there. And for a number of reasons, I think will become apparent. All right. So here we go. And this is the stretch of the shoreline you all probably know well that I'm really interested in. And I'd like to start with why. Why should we study cities in carbon flows? And this may seem counterintuitive, but when you really unpack how carbon works in our lives, it starts to really yield so many levels of wonder. So the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon atoms through the Earth's biosphere. And we have different carbon sinks. Our bodies are made up mostly of carbon and a few other elements. And there's a fixed amount of carbon on the Earth. And so it's that carbon economy that climate change specialists are really concerned about. It's an incredible element. Carbon as a building block, you see it here in so many different materials: diamonds, graphite, nanotubes, graphene, like high-tech materials. But carbon is almost essential to life. Almost all life metabolizes carbon. Some things down in the bottom of the deep sea maybe don't work quite the same way. And so we can think of carbon not just as gasoline or petroleum or coal, and fossil fuels, but also as part of a spectrum of fuels that include biofuels, fuels that are essential for life, human life, like food, but also wood, trees, charcoal, things like that. And so I'm really interested in charcoal. I've been 6 months telling people I'm interested in charcoal, and people are like, why charcoal? And to me, there are a couple of reasons for it. First of all, it's an incredible ancient biofuel, from trees. But the important thing about charcoal is that by pyrolyzing wood, you take wood with all of its water and other things, you make it 70% carbon. And that charcoal from the 3rd century BC or even before was very useful for making high fire goods like metallurgy, iron, or even steel, stoneware, things like that. So charcoal is industrially very useful. And what's amazing is that I think most of us, including myself, and this started in my research on Saigon, had a sense that, well, that's an old-fashioned fuel. That's from the early modern era. Surely by the 20th century, nobody was still using charcoal. And the reality is that all of the steam-powered technology, rice mills, electric generators, steamboats, even trains, in areas that had abundant supplies of mangrove and charcoal, we're still using that because it was cheaper than coal. So these biofuels actually carry into the mid-20th century as an essential fuel. And Penang is remarkable because the use of charcoal in terms of the fuel politics of the city, even in terms of steel manufacturing over across the water, continues into the 1960s. because this region happens to be the epicenter for mangrove forests on the planet in the Indo-Pacific region. And so charcoal is a real fuel. It's a real industrial fuel that's used in the city quite late compared to other places. And by focusing on charcoal, I think it also helps to keep the focus on the fact that our carbon politics and how we use fossil fuels versus living fuels or biofuels or non-carbon sources of energy like solar or hydro are, very much complicated. We're not just talking about fossil fuels in the modern era. Of course, coal is old biofuel. How old? 300 million years, locked down deep below the earth. And since the late 1700s, humans have been bringing it out, burning it, and releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And of course, hydrocarbons. When you really look at carbon-based fuels, hydrocarbons are amazing. Hydrocarbons unlock a treasure chest of chemicals that can be derived since the late 1800s and are essential in our modern industrial economies. And so all of these different carbon fuels exist in an energy matrix or mix of energy supplies. And one of the things I think is interesting in looking at the history of cities is how cities choose, how people choose between these different fuel sources and how cities are built based on these different fuel sources. So the story that I'm trying to tell is a story about cities and energy and how cities are built around different energy regimes, different kinds of energy. So I think the other side of this, and this is very much built in the present, is that understanding carbon is essential to the future of healthy cities. As somebody who studies pyrolization, the making of charcoal, making things, this is one of the cutting edge fields right now for waste management. Researchers around the world are looking at ways to heat waste material that is mostly carbon to eliminate most of the other chemicals and give you something called biochar, biocharcoal. And if you have charcoal filters on your sink, you know that carbon atoms, they absorb a lot of other chemical elements because of that structure. And so biochar is being seen as a potential win-win in terms of converting huge amounts of waste into a safe environmental material that can be used in different applications. So, yeah. And again, I want to use charcoal and carbon as a way to understand how cities like Penang formed. And so there's one kind of nerdy term that I want to use. I use this in my environmental history classes with students called energy regime. And when we talk about energy, we have to think about energy not just as a material, but also as something connected to political and economic organizations or webs. And so you don't get an energy into your city simply by wishing it. You need to have companies, organizations. Petroleum is a good example, right? We don't pull petroleum out of the ground. We go to a gas station run by a multinational corporation like Shell. We give them our money. They do all of that work, right? All around the planet. And that is a very powerful organization that does that. So that's an energy regime. And there's a political dimension, there's an economic dimension, but there also are political and economic dimensions to biofuels. No energy source is guilt-free. Now you may look at this image. This is an image of ox carts, beautiful ox carts on, I think, Beach Street in Old Georgetown. You can see the telegraph lines, so there's already electricity here going in the early, and these men are carrying whatever goods are being portaged onto the steps of the waterfront to wherever they're going in the city. So this is a biofuel energy regime. where's the energy? The energy is human labor and animal labor. Humans and animals need to be fed. And that food is a kind of industrial fuel. It's mostly carbon and it's feeding these people. The other side of traditional pre-fossil fuel styles of work like this is that it takes a lot of people to do this work and a lot of animals. And sometimes that involves forcing people to do that work or trafficking people to do that work. Labor contractors, you get thousands and thousands of laborers. Do they have full rights in the city? Probably not. They're often used terms like coolie to describe them. They're seen as subhuman by many parts of the society, but their labor is essential. And so by switching from biofuels to fossil fuels or machines, there are many people that say this is liberating. Right? So no form of energy is guilt-free. And that's certainly the case today in the green fuels game with palm oil refining and other places like that. Right. So that's the energy dynamics. And waterfronts, I think, are really key to understanding this energy economy in cities, and especially industrial waterfronts. And the industrial waterfront that I'm especially interested in here is this area along the Brick Kiln Road and these various Tai Gat, Presscave Gat, all the way up to Magazine Road and all the way down to the Sungai Penang. That area is the industrial waterfront of Penang. And in my opinion, as a tourist here, it's very much ignored. And it's fascinating. The tenements that are built after Kamtar, where all of those thousands of people are given flats in these giant maze of buildings along McCallum in the night market area, all of it built on reclaimed land. To me, it's fascinating. And I suspect that those flats, the people are the displaced former laborers who used to work the waterfront when that energy is no longer needed. Also in this area on this old map, you see Espoy, the smelting operation. So you've got your smelters behind these working class streets. And you see down here, this is where the jetties are located, the different clan jetties. And the clan jetties were very much part of the lighter trade. They were getting goods on and off small boat and packing them for the big ships for import and export. And you see other things along here too on the old maps. The butchers, where pigs were kept because they're obviously not halal. So different communities didn't want the pigs. Destructor or incinerators, that's where all the trash of Georgetown is being burned. So this is the economic pulse of the city. It's the metabolic pulse of the city. It's where the fuel is coming in. It's where it's being consumed and turned into industrial goods like tin, the biggest export. It's where human labor, all of those masses of human labor are being quartered. And are the coolies allowed to run all over the city? Absolutely not. In a sense, they're kind of packed into this waterfront area, into these jetties, into these temporary occupation zones. And so the fuels in the early 20th century here are, we can think of them as food, rice. Belichan is an amazing food, a preserved protein-rich fish product that can be shipped thousands of miles and used to add to rice to feed laborers at tin mines or on the docks. The charcoal is supporting cook fuels in almost every kitchen, but it's more important for smelting. It's key to smelting because coal contains sulfur, and sulfur makes bad iron. And so charcoal does not contain sulfur. And so smelters use charcoal even when they have access to coal because it makes a higher quality iron, and for lower temperature smelting like tin, it's also preferred. So charcoal is still coming into to this city. And of course, the energy matrix is always changing. It's never stuck in one mode. And so some of the chapters in the city's history that I'm going to focus on are when those energy shifts are happening. This is a little bit closer up. The other thing I would say is that when we look at the waterfront of a city, we have to think of it not just as a fixed iconic place like Georgetown, but we have to think of it in relation to other waterfronts. And the fact that a city's economy is only as good as the web of other importers and exporters in the region that are helping this city function. And the most important waterfront next to the Georgetown area is across the river on the Parai area. And the Parai area, the British government in the early 1900s is already aware that it can no longer manage the waterfront in Georgetown. And they're already working to develop on the Parai side the rail linkages. They're moving industry across the water by the 1930s. And so, so these maps also give us an interesting picture of this urban waterfront. Over here is the key smelting area. And my reading of early 1900s history in Penang is that tin is everything. Tin smelting is everything for this city. And this is the biggest smelter. The rail lines, the trams from the docks along Penang Road, they end near Times Square over here, and that's the smelter. So that's big business. Here is the incinerator. That's where all the waste goes for all of Georgetown over here. There's the pig market across the water, kept at a reasonable distance. And then some other interesting things I didn't know about, an opium farm. Did you know opium? The opium farm. It's right here on the waterfront in a very controlled area. The Indian Immigration Depot is right next to it. Right. So that's kind of the encircling area I think is really environmentally interesting in the city, and also politically for looking at what happens to these people later. On the other side, this is the key wharf area here. You know it as, I think, the ferry landing and a few other things. But also important is this is where the petroleum comes in. Standard Oil and Dutch Shell and other oil farms, the tank farms are coming in over here. And the rail lines from Singapore are coming in over here. So I was looking at charcoal and I found this book at Eureka Books, Ui Chinggi's Photographic History. And again, I found this place fascinating, Kwai Jetty, because it was destroyed. It doesn't exist anymore. With Chi Sing, we met Catherine Kwai. We met a Kwai family historian who had all kinds of opinions about the story of this jetty. And I thought, aha, here's the historic place where the fuel came into the city. And I said, well, how old is this jetty? And said about 1950. I said, so this is a much more recent story. And she said, yeah, but the Kwai clan, its main business was the import and export and processing of charcoal fuels for the city. They worked at other places along Weld Key. But then later, after 1950, with new demand, all of that kind of dirty industry got pushed down to the far south of Weld Key. And that's where it started there. And this is really unusual, but I think it points to the importance of charcoal fuels for smelting in this city. And this city had a unique history with tin. It's different from other Southeast Asian cities. And that particular clan had a unique hold on cornering this fuel trade in the city, which allowed them to have this jetty rather late in the history. So I'll get to that. But before we get to the modern politics, I do want to take one more side step. I hope it's okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm a little bit in Southeast Asian history teacher mode, so I apologize. But mangrove charcoal is amazing, and it actually has a really ancient history. I had the chance to travel up to Kedah and up to the Bunang Valley and to the archaeological sites there. And this is the tree, Bacau minyak, or Rhizophora piculata. That is the main species used, not just in the last 100 years on the Malay Peninsula, but over the last 3 millennia. 3 millennia, this tree has been used for charcoal. And mangroves and the coastal areas around them were the earliest trading sites in Southeast Asian history. Mangroves are very ideal wood for charcoal. They pyrolyze evenly. They're hardwood. But the most important thing is they float. They're on the water next to the place where people are trading. This includes Southeast Asian cities like Penang. It's much easier to float your fuel in than it is to put it on a train like coal or put it in a pipeline. So the wood, it floats to the kilns, and the kilns, once they process the charcoal, it becomes super light, and they float it to wherever the work is being done. This is an amazing place. This is my charcoal factory in Kuala Sepetang. It's not too far from here. It's a great weekend trip with the kids. There's a lot of stuff to see. The owner is very friendly. But this is actually a very late charcoal kiln, allegedly a Japanese design borrowed from Thailand. There was much earlier kiln work going on there. But here you can see the logs piled up by the waterway. Charcoal is still made by floating logs in. It is incredibly labor intensive. I asked about the laborers involved in cutting the wood in Kuala Sepetang, and they're mostly Bangladeshi. They're not local because it's really hard work. And so even now, labor is critical in this biofuel industry. And this is what you see. This is a 60-kilogram bag of pikul. And pikuls are the unit of measurement for import and export of charcoal. And where is most of this charcoal going? This charcoal is going to Japan. Japan is the biggest consumer of using it for cooking. So it's really a specialty market now. But basically, charcoal has been made the same way over millennia. And it's been carried in 60-kilogram bags because that's the maximum that a human can carry on their back all day long. So why use charcoal? Well, the great empires in Asia and India and China realized that you need high heat, 1500 degrees Celsius, to melt iron ore, to get the slag off to make iron. And so in northern China, they cut down all their trees, use them for charcoal, and then they started digging up coal to use coal. But coal is a really undesirable fuel. Those are Chinese iron ingots, and those ingots are traded all over Southeast Asia from the early Common Era, 2nd, 3rd century. The second thing you see here is stoneware or porcelain. So most of the ceramics in Southeast Asia before 1400 are called earthenware. They're cooked in kilns at about 700 degrees Celsius. To get above 1,000, you can't do it with firewood. You have to have a carbon fuel, a high carbon fuel. And that's where this beautiful stoneware, that's where this begins to appear. High fire ceramics, they actually vitrify. They turn to glass, the clay, and it becomes a different material. And in the tropics, you don't really need this so much because you want your earthenware to breathe. You want things always to breathe, right? And glass. So in order to have these kinds of industries, even in the ancient era, you need to have charcoal. That's the only way you can do it. And so up in Kedah in the Bunang Valley, this is the Sungai Batu site. And what's fascinating about it are these, if you've been to it, it's not just one brick platform, it's about 15 brick platforms. And this is one of the earliest sites in Southeast Asia for iron smelting. And they are Indian-style furnaces that are built. And there's iron ore. The archaeologists debate. Some people say it's way, way early. Some people say it's later. I'm not even going to give you a date because I don't want to get dragged into the debates of archaeologists and nationalists. But I'll say it's really impressive. And when you look at this site, you can understand why iron production happened here because of the proximity of the site to the water for import-export and also to the mangroves. They still surround the site today. So you can only have these sites for industrial production close to your fuel source. Malaysia has abundant fuel. Malaysia has abundant ore. What it lacks is labor. And this has been a case for over 2 millennia. It has to do with the tropical environment versus temperate zones with grasslands and deltas. Anyway, let's get out of the history class. Let's go back to the modern era. You survived. Congrats. I'm sorry if you had a bad history teacher. Hopefully I'm not one of those. Okay. So charcoal as a fuel in industrial mining. We're in the 1900s. The mining boom is global. There are gold rushes, tin rushes, silver rushes. People all over Earth are migrating by the thousands, tens of thousands to go to these mining places to get rich. Chinese migrants are not just coming to Malaysia, they're crossing the Pacific to go to Gold Mountain, to find gold in California. The Americans don't have enough laborers to build their railroads in the desert, the most brutal deserts you can imagine. So what do? They contract thousands and thousands of laborers from China to build the railroads. And after they build the railroads, what do? They say goodbye, and you can't be a citizen, etc. That's American politics. But what's interesting is that mining, if you're not near a railroad, you need fuel. And so the silver mines actually build charcoal kilns in the desert, and they bring all of the available wood, which isn't much. It's a desert, unlike the tropics. And this is actually a Swiss-Italian design for kilns. So there's no single culture that, is the boss of kilns. But they build these charcoal kilns to smelt the silver. And so charcoal as an industrial fuel in the industrial era in the 19th century, in this sort of boom period, remains very important, especially in the mining and smelting industries. And we find kilns all over Malaysia. Most of them have fallen apart. It's just bricks and charcoal. This is one in Langkawi. These kilns were made to produce charcoal from Langkawi's abundant forests to then export to Penang. So Penang became a kind of transshipment place for a lot of fuels. And Matang, the Port Weld station, that was all about getting the tin and ore down to the water. And it was built in the mangrove forest, and mangrove charcoal was used not just for smelting, but also for powering the train between Port Weld, Kuala Sepetang, and Taiping. So this little train that was going back and forth. And we actually had a trip with a local historian, and he drove us down the old train track pathway. It was absolutely fascinating. Most of it's not train track anymore. Okay, so Penang's growth, its boom, its mining boom, its tin mining boom, this rich heyday when the giant mansions are being built, like the beautiful Peranakan mansion, that's being built on wealth from mining, from charcoal, from smelting, from all of these mass labor enterprises, which are not politically always nice, right? There's a lot of interesting elements. But we worked in the archive and the National Archive, and I was just curious to see in the early 1900s what kind of documents exist and whether this was a problem in the Malay Peninsula. And I found quite a lot of documents. The British colonial government is complaining about the costs of labor and the fact that the labor groups that are involved in the smelting business all around Selangor, Perak, Kedah, and in Penang are basically cutting down all of the charcoal trees for almost nothing. The colonial government's getting nothing out of it, and they're running out of fuel. And so they're facing a dilemma. They still have plenty of ore in the ground. They have the labor, but they don't have the fuel. And so this is a document from a colonial civil servant who has a bright idea. He says, for each labor boss who's procuring the charcoal for the smelting, I'm gonna require them to pay a $10 tax per laborer. Now, a labor boss in Perak, like Giheng, he's a tokong. we're talking maybe what, 5,000 laborers who are working in his enterprises in forestry, in charcoal production. This is a big thing. Giheng actually, there's another Tokong, and they conflict over business, and they have a civil war in Perak. I mean, the museum in Matang is fascinating for showing some of that history. And so these are big operations, and this colonial servant thinks, I've got the solution. We're going to recoup the money so we can plant new trees to keep the fuel supply by getting the Tokong to pay $10 for his 5,000 employees. And this is the response. He basically says, no way in hell are we ever going to do it. If you British want your tin exported to Britain for your industrial enterprises, you better shut up and take our charcoal and keep your smelting operation going. And the British even try in this interaction here, in just this one document, saying, well, you don't have to attach the license, the coolie license, to a single person. You can move them around. Just buy some, so that, you know, you're licensed for so many people working in the charcoal trade. And of course, it really goes nowhere, except that this is the beginning of British forestry in the mangrove forests. And I will say that mangrove forests have a bad reputation. They're not usable timber for most of the timber trade. They're seen, in the term charcoal forest is a negative term that's used, like this forest is good for nothing but fuel. And so for the British, they're actually the first of the colonial governments in Southeast Asia and in the world to actually map and survey mangrove forests and to take seriously the management of them, which are, of course, really different from dryland forests. But there's quite a lot in the archival record. I'm still working with it in terms of making sense of some of these documents and some of these characters. But it's really a concern. And this is the Giheng Temple. Here you can see my friend in our tourist attire at the entrance there. And another element to this that I'm working on with Chi-Seng's help is also to better understand the Chinese labor perspective in this trade and those human experiences, which again are really fascinating in these frontier areas. All right, so that's one perspective from documents. Another perspective from the documents is from these kind of macro scale colonial import-export records. And I love reading spreadsheets. It's a guilty pleasure. And what this spreadsheet is telling us is I think quite interesting in the larger scale. And it gets into that networked relationship between Penang and other area cities. This is a map of imports on the left and exports on the right, a spreadsheet talking about the charcoal that's being imported. And of course, colonial records talk about tin, they talk about coal, they talk about petroleum, and all the things being imported and exported. This is in 1897. And what it's telling us, the first two columns are Singapore. These are the Straits settlements. The middle columns are Penang. And then the columns on the right are Malacca. So what this tells us is up here at the beginning, for imports, the Achenese ports in northern Sumatra are importing piculs of charcoal into Penang. And then Penang is exporting out charcoal, which is kind of weird. But it's like some level of import, but much more export is going to Aceh. And the connection with Aceh in this period, I think, is really interesting. And then further down here, this is the big part. Of course, Hong Kong is not sending any charcoal here. Hong Kong, they have, and Guangzhou and all of the southern coast of China, they have eaten up all of their available wood supplies well a few centuries before. There's too much. Think about Zhangdezhen, the famous ceramic blue and white pottery, exporting kilns. They're exporting all over the world. They've consumed all of their available charcoal. They're buying charcoal from anyone who will sell so they can keep making pottery and exporting it to the world. And so Penang actually becomes a very big exporter of its charcoal to Hong Kong. You can imagine the cost of shipping charcoal to Hong Kong. It's very expensive, all the labor involved. But that's one of the big suppliers. And thanks to the British Empire, it makes sense for Penang to be able to sell charcoal to Hong Kong. The other thing you see is that the bigger competitor, Singapore, they're getting their charcoal and their supplies because they also have smelters. They also have a lot of this industrial work going on from nearby. They're getting it from Sumatra, from the vast mangrove forest. And then finally, the problem of Thailand, which is that Siam proper, the Bangkok side, they've eaten up all of their wood. Same is true in Saigon. They've eaten up all of their wood supply. And so they are importing charcoal and they're sending rice to Singapore in exchange. And on the West Coast, Trong and Krabi, they're quite rich in mangroves. So they're actually importing, they're sending charcoal down to Penang because Penang's the big urban consumer. So charcoal is really important in the city. And just for comparison, I look at coal, and coal is extremely important in other parts of the region, in India, in Japan, in Singapore, but there's no imports of coal coming into Penang in 1897, which is kind of strange. There's almost no trade in coal, and there's no trade in petroleum. That starts quite late here in the city. So Penang's story with energy in my research is really interesting, I think, in the sense that this city's relationship with this old biofuel, this ancient biofuel, is allowed to continue well into the 20th century, into the 1920s, when other cities in other parts of Asia, especially in Japan and later Singapore, definitely Bangkok, Saigon, have to switch to fossil fuels and more expensive fuels, and fuels that have a very different political economy. Because if you're getting petroleum from Saigon, you're not getting it. Vietnam doesn't produce petroleum. You're getting it from British and Dutch Shell. You're getting it from American companies, Caltex, and you're dependent on them. And if they don't want to ship you the oil, if something happens like World War II, then you don't have any fuel at all. You don't have charcoal, you don't have anything. So Penang is rich, thanks to the mangroves. Of course, the mangroves are getting cut down, and we're worried about that now. So it's good with that, but unlike these other cities, it has labor and traffic problems. And we all know about the traffic problems, but these are traffic problems on the docks. The lighter loading and unloading. This has become a complete nightmare by the 1920s, the need for a modern wharf space. And this is where my conversation with Iche one day at the library was extremely helpful. And Iche was showing me documents, especially this long report from, I think, 1926 or 1928, somewhere in there, where they're talking about expanding Weld Quay. But to expand Weld Quay, you have to push out thousands of people, not just on the jetties, but all the people working, the coolies working. They live near where they work. And so you have to pull them out. And these are discussions. The British are really good sometimes at preserving these long, elaborate documents with these long conversations. But here you see about the harbor board, the Penang Harbor Board. They're debating how to do this. And they're talking about the problem, which is that the area for landing goods in the Weld Quay area is just too narrow. There's so much going on that the future economy of the city is in jeopardy. And shortly after that, colonial office records begin showing another discussion about slum clearance. And of course, the word slum is very pejorative. It's where all the poor working people live. And so this is from about 1934, so during the Great Depression. And at this point, you see the beginnings of this problematization of that industrial waterfront. and people are beginning to look at something here in the future. The charcoal debates continue through World War II. You see strikes, you see the coolies demanding higher wages, and the Japanese are playing a bigger industrial role in Southeast Asia in the 1930s. And in Japan, just like in Germany and France, they're experimenting with using charcoal as a fuel for automobiles. They create wood gas, and then they run the car on wood gas. So there are all kinds of crazy things happening, but basically this is the end of a cheap fuel supply, and it's the beginning of problems here with laborers. And in other parts of Southeast Asia after World War II, this problem really disappears. Cities like Saigon are flooded with petroleum, with foreign, especially American assistance. But what's really interesting is that the charcoal trade continues here because of the smelting operations, because of tin smelting, later steel manufacturing. And so, so we see even in the 1960s, when steel production is vital to nation building, having your own steel production, we see that one of the big companies, Malayawata Steel, this is over on the other side of the water here, they're still working with charcoal, only at this point, it's no longer mangroves. It's the rubber plantations that are being cut down, and the rubber wood is being pyrolyzed and used as fuel. So in the 1960s, industry is moving out of Georgetown, at least old industries like some of these operations. Gas is replacing charcoal stoves in households. Electrification with Tenaga National is happening all across the island. In motor vehicles like the Honda Super Cub are showing up and beginning to really change the energy economy in the city. And this is an area I want to study more, that what I call the Kamtar area. You know, I'm fascinated by Kamtar. I've spent so much time in Kamtar. I know it's not the best looking building, but there's so much fascinating history about working people, about the labor, and about this industrial waterfront and how it gets transformed. And if you look at those tenements in those big buildings around McCallum, and you say, not just, oh, they're not the best looking buildings, but you think about the idealism of the Kamtar era, of what to do with all those laborers from that biofuel period after they're no longer needed, they're excess. And you say, well, at least they had a plan. I mean, at least it was an idea, right? And there's with public housing, I think public housing is a fascinating area for more research in this period. And finally, the charcoal prices continue to get more and more expensive. And this is actually a news story in Penang of housewives boycotting charcoal because it's just gotten too expensive to use, even in the kitchen. So I'm fascinated with this waterfront, and I like waterfronts because there's just so many stories, and not just the tourist-friendly Georgetown Peranakan Mansion story. There are lots of other stories to be told. And I think these stories can be really useful for debates about future planning in the city, about what to do, especially how to look at old areas of the city, like Times Square, like these old waterfront GAT in the McCallum night market area, you know, and thinking about other histories that can be told. They're interesting. They're not just interesting to Penang, but they link Penang to a global network of other places that were involved in these businesses. So here you can see, if you go back, so that's the old waterfront, and I'm sure most people here know with reclamation, there's so much change happening in here, and that brown area is the sort of McCallum area that gets expanded into the public housing. And you see the southernmost jetty there, that's the Kwai jetty that basically is surrounded by this new reclamation. And so its days are numbered. And this is the dirty industry jetty, the charcoal jetty. And even the smelter, Escoy, is running out of business, and they're beginning to close shop. So we can see that this energy regime has a kind of final point in the 1960s using these biofuels. But when an energy regime stops, it often has knock-on social and political effects, and those are some of the debates about what to do with the jetty. There's a lot of protests by the Kwai clan and other people. And that's what it looks like today on Google Maps. And I don't know why it has these particular businesses, except I've been a lot of times to Dean's Nasi Kandar. It's one of my favorites. So I think Google remembered that and showed it there. But it's also interesting because until I did this research, I didn't know that Dean's was located on the old brick kiln road. That's actually the edge of that very important neighborhood. All right, so you've been a very nice audience. I will wrap up now. I've gone from history professor, now I'm going to go to sort of MC mode. But again, this is the waterfront that I think is so fascinating in the city, and in my opinion as a tourist, is completely invisible. And I think there may be a sense in some ways that it's a sense of shame, saying, well, it's not the prettiest part of the city. But if you do look at urban renewal in places, Singapore, Seoul, Korea, other cities in the world, there's a lot of attention now to these mid-century areas and to telling other histories. And there's a lot of interest on the part of tourists also, and not just seeing what how the millionaire lived in Peranakan Mansion with all of his family and that whole like drama, but actually thinking what it was like to work on the wharfs, or what it was like to work in the smelters, where, you know, go to the charcoal factory, things like that. So I'll end kind of where my old graduate school history advisor would say, so what? So what does this history tell us? And historians hate it when they give a talk for someone to tell them that. So I'm going to go ahead and ask myself, so what? Why study this? Why do we study carbon flows? It's a story. I think it's a different perspective on the city than focusing on the millionaires or focusing on the famous Victoria clock or the monuments and things. There are other stories, and I think stories have a power. They're very useful for spurring different kinds of debates and looking at different elements of a problem. And so I think carbon flows, why not? Why not study it? And we talk about carbon, but we don't think about it historically. We don't think about carbon in our lives in any meaningful way. And I think that the eco-politics of cities are extremely important. I think it's important for people, citizens in cities, in people engaged in urban politics, to understand eco-politics not just as a greenwashed ideal, that, okay, let's build a park, or, okay, we're not using coal, that's good. I mean, maybe it is good, but every energy source, wind, solar, they all have costs, and you have to think about what those costs are. Secondly, I think it's important for cities and for urban history to be connected to global history. So often, and this happens in places like New York or Los Angeles as well, city histories are very nationalistic or very localistic. And I think it's important to understand that urban history really is world history. We see the changes in flows of fuel and economy. I mean, just yesterday I was reading about the 3D chip manufacturing in Kulim, in Kedah State, just across the border there. And I mean, it's amazing. This is really the center, like Silicon Valley, for the future of AI. You know, so it may be a local industry hiring people, but it's connected to what's happening all around the planet. And basically by doing this history, we see that that's nothing new. That cities like Penang have always been global cities in that way. And finally, I think it's important to have a greater awareness of energy and carbon, and maybe to somehow build new language. So those are the things that I hope to get out of the story. I'm working on it as an essay with my co-author, Chi Sing. And lastly, I just want to thank really all of the organizations that have supported me here, especially Penang Institute, but also Universiti Sains Malaysia, the School of Humanities, the history section, and the Malaysian American Committee for Educational Exchange. That's the Fulbright affiliate here in Malaysia. And just so many, so much paperwork, so much negotiations. But it really has been my pleasure, and I thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for Prof. David Biggs' very interesting history. I forgot to introduce myself. I am Dr. Tan Chi Seng from History Section, School of Humanities, Universiti Sains Malaysia. I'm a host to Prof. David for the past 6 months as a Fulbright Scholar. So actually, from what Prof. David actually shared with us, the history of Penang and Georgetown, it could be explored through the carbon flow, the energy. It's not only like national politics or maybe culture, but when you walk around Klang Jetties, Eastern is melting, that you see a transformer, bumblebee there. You can think about not only transformer, but actually the carbons. Maybe the carbon can help to reactivate bumblebee, right? Maybe. Okay. So we can see that there's a story we can share about Penang, about Georgetown through carbon flow, energy, and also Penang as a port in the region, in the national, and also throughout the global history. Penang Port is one of the global cities. And one of the things, maybe a story from Prof. David's talk, we can explore, because we always talk about like the Penang food, char kway teow, okay, char kway teow, or maybe mee goreng. And one of the very special of char kway teow is we use the charcoal, okay, to fry. Okay, so it looks very nice and delicious with the charcoal. So maybe we can have a story of Penang char kway teow and carbon flow and charcoal. Then maybe a story. So actually, from like what Prof. David shared with us, history is not within the classroom. History is not only like politics, culture, or others, but it can be beyond into carbon, into energy, into biofuel, and a new topic for us to explore, Penang char kway teow, carbon flows, and globalizations. How do you bring Penang's char kway teow out of Penang, then maybe go to Los Angeles and California? You want to fry it not by using maybe gasoline, by using charcoal. Maybe charcoal can be exported to California. You have a Penang char kway teow in California using charcoal, the energy flow and carbon flow from Penang to Penang to Los Angeles and California. So we can see that history very interesting. Now is our Q&A session. We welcome the floor to ask the questions. You can let us know your name and also maybe you're from which organization, and Prof. David will answer your questions. Or you're welcome to ask questions. And maybe you can, if there are some questions from the YouTube, you can let us know as well. Yeah.
My name is Raymond. Actually, it's a bit embarrassing as a Penangite to ask this question, but in Penang, are we still harvesting mangroves for charcoal making? And if we are, is it on a sustainable basis? Are we actually replanting back? I mean, if it is still being harvested, is it being replanted back on a sustainable basis?
That's a great question. There are kind of two answers to it. So in the state of Penang, as far as I know, there's no charcoal production. I mean, the land is much more valuable now for IKEA or, Boston Scientific or, chip processing. So land comes at a premium, but in Perak and Kuala Sepetang, that's the Matang forest. That is a managed forest. And it's actually considered one of the leaders in the world for mangrove forestry, sustainable forestry. And, it's really interesting to go to this mangrove planting corporate what did they call it, Fatih? Corporate social responsibility. And a lot of the big corporations in Pulau Penang, they do this work, and there are nonprofit organizations that facilitate mangrove planting. And I would call some of that work, I mean, it's fascinating for the people to get to be in a mangrove swamp and plant mangrove trees. But I did manage to talk to some of the fishermen turned mangrove tree planters who were getting paid by the NGO to do this work. And I said, what do you think of it? Just kind of offhand. I don't know if I told you this story, Fatih. Fatih's company did the thing and I got to join along. And the fishermen said, well, hey, we're stuck here behind this levee and this is fresh water, over there is salt water. And we're planting these mangroves today, but this land's just, on the south of the Pulau Penang border. And if it becomes a big industrial plant, they're going to mow it all down and they'll just plant it somewhere else. Like, we'll still have a job planting mangrove because the trees that get planted 5 years later get ripped out. So there are some issues with reforestation. The cause of mangrove reforestation is one that we hear about, we see about, because it's so important for biodiversity, for coastal ecosystems, storm prevention, all these other things. But that was your next, yeah. Carbon sequestration, it's actually called blue-green ecology because it is one of the best ecosystems for carbon sequestration on the planet. Those trees pull and hold so much carbon. The problem is it's coastal property. And industrial urban areas, that coastal property is critical for logistics and transshipment and, all of these issues. If you don't have roads, then you have shipping lanes or rail access and things like that. So Malaysia is not alone in that. In fact, I think Malaysia is probably leading the world in terms of advanced mangrove forestry and the number of NGOs. And it's a story that probably doesn't get told that much. But the global situation with mangroves right now is still really a problem. The last thing I'll say about charcoal is there's a lot of illegal or just wild cutting happening right now in Myanmar. And Myanmar has had really incredible mangrove forests, some of the last, because of conflict, to be cut down. But under the current military regime, a lot of those areas are being cut, processed, and then just sold on, export. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, nice to meet you.
Forest cover in Penang has been lost by 70% in the last 25 years. Excessive increase in urban areas, 22%. Average land surface temperature increased by 8 degrees. Urban heat island has come to over 38 degrees centigrade in the last 25 years. This is an ecological disaster. Many attempts to suggest what we are suggesting. Mangrove swamps are being cut down. I think you go to why. You see, massive destruction of mangrove.
Yeah.
And this adds on to the already excessive problem of damage.
I'll tell you a slight story in response to it. And I think we have to be cognizant of where we're from and our perspectives. Me in California, looking at Southeast Asian cities and looking at mangroves. I love mangroves, coastal ecosystems. And this started in my work in Ho Chi Minh City. And I said, wow, I've seen these projections of sea level rise. And these projections have water covering all of the Mekong Delta, where 20 million people live, Rice Bowl, half of Ho Chi Minh City, where 25 million people live, and huge other areas, Manila, Bangkok, Kolkata, all these huge cities will have massive problems. And being in California, where we're prone to earthquakes and other disasters, in Hollywood, I was like, oh, the cities of Southeast Asia are doomed. I have to do something. I have to study it. And I know the Saigon story, but I didn't know the Penang story. And I thought, wow, you know, there's this Matang forest and people are here. They're going to be really interested in preserving the coastline, and they're going to be really worried about climate change. And only to go to like Gurney and see this giant island being constructed. And Bayan Lepas, another giant island being constructed. And across the water, the IKEA, the area, the bulldozers, and of course, there's one way to say this is an ecological disaster, but I think another way of looking at it is that obviously people in mass here are not worried about sea level. And if you think about the jetties, for example, people across Asia, from India to China, have been living on water, moving up and down for millennia. So as far as honestly what people feel about rising water, I honestly think it presents a development opportunity, because one person's disaster is another person's opportunity. So you know, it was really humbling to say, hey, you dumb American, like with your Hollywood fantasy about Southeast Asia, like people here are okay. They're going to be fine when the water goes up or the water goes down. They're going to squabble about how to use the land because it's waterfront property. It's useful. But to get back to your question, so I thought, well, what's the model here? Like, what's the model? It's not a eco nature loving, you know, I mean, there's your huge populations that need to eat, that need to work, who need, you know, jobs. And I went to Singapore, and a friend said, you got to go to the Urban Redevelopment Authority and see their presentation. Some would call it propaganda. I mean, the Singaporean state is very good at promoting Singapore. They only have to do it for one city. I mean, it's not so complicated, but it's compelling when you see the Singapore state says, we're mowing down this place, we're building up this place as part to sequester carbon. We're trying to go carbon neutral, but going carbon neutral in Singapore requires this really powerful authority that can tell you in your flat mortgage will end in this year because we're tearing down your building and we're going to put a park or a mangrove forest or a freeway there. And I think the argument of Singapore is one that deserves more attention, which is to say that we're not going to get out of this dilemma of our urban future, our industrial future, by just imagining a world with lots of mangrove forests and not so many people. You know, I think that the next step solution, given population increases and the global economy, is actually a more intentional model, where you actually need to say, this area is going to be heavy industry, or this area is going to be high rises, and this area is going to be a biodiverse mangrove forest. And that kind of rewilding is something that has taken hold in some places. Last part of this. In Europe is a very not wild place, right? It's very industrial. It has some pretty gardens, but there's not a lot of wildlife there. And in Rotterdam is one of the biggest ports in the world, one of the 3 busiest ports. Rotterdam is built on reclaimed land, under sea level. That's the Dutch. A third of their country is under sea level. When they expanded the port, they said, this section over here, it's about 1,000 hectares, 1,500 hectares is going to be a nature reserve. It's all under sea level. And what happened was the managers of that place just said, let nature just retake this area. And the state said, we're never going to develop that in perpetuity. It's protected by law. Nobody can touch it. So about 20 years ago, some ecologists were doing bioassay surveys in that particular spot, next to the busiest port in the world. They found it was the most biodiverse place in all of Europe. And they've lately they had deer populations, they brought back wolves and apex predators, they brought back wild horses. And so it's a really interesting place. It's biodiverse, carbon sequestration, and it's completely artificial. It's completely invented. It should be sea bottom. So I get what you're saying about these challenges and the outrage. I just think that the challenge is not to demonize cities or demonize industrial enterprises, but really to engage them in some way. And maybe it's not the Singapore way, but something like that.
Sorry, just now the gentleman, sorry.
My name is Taj, as an individual. Talking about Kuala Sepetang, which you visited. I'm curious on a historical perspective, whether, as you mentioned, obviously the mangrove that was converted into charcoal was exported to Penang. My curiosity on this is whether at the same time you realize that was the first railway line in Malaysia connecting Taiping to Port Well, which was the English name for Kuala Sepetang.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how much of the coal or the charcoal that was generated there was actually sent to Penang by sea versus by rail. Because the British built that mainly to support the tin mining industry. And the tin mining industry basically would be using, delivering tin to the port, coming back empty. Did they by any chance then move charcoal back and then move it up north through the rails because they would carry a higher volume faster? But I think that would be in the terms of your records. You were looking the ledgers. It would be an interesting question to see whether there was a complementary business going on.
Yeah, that's
okay, That's one. The other is just a comment, okay? I'm a Penangite, nevertheless. However, from your presentation and your studies, you're very Penang Island-centric. I think if you'll be looking at the tin industry and charcoal use, and you mentioned Malaya Wata, we should actually see the charcoal use used in Prai. That means how was charcoal transported from Kuala Sepetang up to Prai? To both, this wouldn't be in the early 18th centuries, but would be in the late 19th centuries. When you by that time had Malaya Wata, and you also had Escoy tin smelting on the Prai side.
Yeah,
I think we should not ignore, because if you understand that Prai was planned and designed as the industrial portion for the island, not Welki. Welki, I believe the trade you mentioned was probably during the early part of the late 18th century, early part of the 19th century, when they had a lot of port work. But when Penang Industria as a boy in the 60s, Prai was the industrial heart of this state. And it'll be interesting to see how this charcoal flowed between the island and the mainland. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question or comment. On the Prai Welki part, that's very late arriving in my research in the last month or so. And what I find interesting is that it's not like it just moves overnight from the island to Prai. The industrialization of Prai starts in about 1919 at the end of World War I. And the looking forward to the movement of dirty industries, basically to the Prai side, is very important strategy of urban development in Georgetown. And there are documents about that, and I've found some, and I'm working on more with that. But what I think is interesting is that industry, once you build industry in a place and you have a footprint like Escoy on the island, with the rail lines and other things, it's very hard to move it, like legally, and land use and all these different agreements that are in place. It takes time. And I know that the Malaysian Smelting Corporation moves on the Prai side, and that is clearly where the future is. And the British see that probably from 1915, with the boom and assembly lines and petroleum. All of the oil tank farms are on the Parai side. And I think that leaders in Georgetown who travel around the world can see that's the future. That you can't have all of that on the island side. It doesn't make economic sense. So I think that that's happening. And what I was trying to get in the talk was to say that we shouldn't be island focused. And then when we think about the waterfront, we should think about the greater waterfront area. I mean, I think the ferry ride from the island to Parai there's so much to see on both sides of the waterfront there. And I use a little scooter and go around just to see what little alleys I can find. And I tried to go to a place called the Tin Club on the Parai side, but it was blocked off and it was trespassing, so I couldn't. But no, it's a great point. And when we think about urbanization, we also have to think about the peripheries. And there's a nice book, Penang and its Peripheries, and talking about all those different areas. The other question was about Sepatang and the mangroves, but I forgot, what was the gist of it? Oh, the rail line. Yeah. So to the extent that I've looked at these early 1900s documents on charcoal, again, like almost all of the charcoal produced in Penang is being used in Perak. It's being used near the initial smelting of the mining operation. So there's an initial smelting process of ore that gets it more pure before you then put that on boats to the smelters. So, and this is the case with charcoal all over Malaysia and all over the world, is that it's a cheap fuel source because nobody's managing the forest. Like you mentioned, like nobody cares about the forest. And if nobody owns it, and you can chop them down, you can use that fuel. It's a lot cheaper than importing, getting a hydroelectric supply for your industrial operation, things like that. So I'm not sure. I don't think that the colonials thought about charcoal on the rail lines, because in terms of volume, it's very light. I think what they were thinking about on the rail was coal and other fuels that are very heavy, and other heavy things like ore that had to pass by rail. But I'll keep looking for that. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I'd like to stretch the timeline maybe a little bit going forward. We went from biofuel to fossil fuel, and it seems to be moving towards renewable. Yeah. And I would like your perspective on where the energy regime or the energy economy will be in 25, 20, 30 years time, where you may even have a situation where countries with abundance of renewables, Cambodia selling energy to Malaysia, for example,
Yeah.
or Australia selling energy to Singapore, for example. How would that affect the energy networks around Southeast Asia? Because I think I focus on Southeast Asia.
I am. Yeah.
And how would you change that energy mix and matrix and whatnot, and how would it affect the economy?
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of thoughts come to mind. One is the transnational power grids and the electricity selling that's happening already in the region, and will definitely continue. The decentralization or denationalization of electric power grids is really a fascinating area. I will say too, my dad was a nuclear engineer, and I got all the propaganda from when I was a kid about nuclear power saving the planet. And my dad always believed, and he's still alive, he still believes that peaceful nuclear power will solve the carbon problem. And I say, yeah, but it might produce other problems like Fukushima or Chernobyl, like that have half-lives 30,000 years. But I actually am thinking about the sort of book about Southeast Asian cities and carbon, and thinking about a future point in which none of our energy comes from carbon. Hydrogen fuel cells in cars, electricity. I mean, the electricity story, there's an historian in the department, Khairul, who's written a study on Tenaga Nasional and building an electric power grid. And it's not that hard to imagine renewables and zero carbon energy supplies that will replace our, all of our others except for food. Obviously, we still need to eat. But in that world where all of those carbon fuels are no longer economically or politically viable, what will be the future of mangrove forests or other lands that we don't need to use, like oil palm? I mean, oil palm is insane. If you're not familiar with oil palm plantations, which I wasn't until I came here, and driving in Sabah, I went on a little week-long trek to see different parts of Malaysia, and it was just, again, it was humbling, saying, well, this is where we are right now, that this, food oil industry keeps people alive. I mean, you need it. I mean, the world needs it. That's why there's oil palm. And in a carbon-free energy matrix, what do you do with all that land? So I think a post-carbon future is imaginable. I don't know if it's in my lifetime. It'll probably be 50 years, 100 years later.
In the state of South Australia, they actually generated 138% of the electricity requirement of the state to renewables. That means they actually have access
Yeah.
to renewables. And when you look at mass storage technology that's coming out, we're talking about the grid, for example, technology. It changes the whole energy economy quite drastically.
Yeah.
People who may not use coal to produce energy.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually sell electricity back to the grid.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Quite a dramatic change in the economy of the world.
And I think that constituencies in terms of urban or state or national corporations, big stakeholders or powerful players, they're all waking up to this. And they're saying that just like the Singapore example with urban redevelopment, like you have to intentionally understand that there's a politics and an economics to every energy choice. You have to hash it out with all the stakeholders, which one you're going to do, how much it's going to cost. People are going to have to pay. It's going to be uncomfortable. There will be fighting. You can't avoid conflict. You have to go into it understanding that and just, with a common aim. And I think that's, for a lot of renewables up until the last 10 years, there's been this kind of dream idea that it's going to solve all our problems. And it will solve the carbon problem, but only if societies locally and globally are understanding that there's going to be pain. You gotta always have trade-offs, But I think it's achievable. And I think part of my interest in carbon is that it's the carbon story with fuels, especially the biofuels. It's kind of we're looking at a moment in history that we may be moving out of, and that we consider it still our modern present. I still have a gas guzzling Subaru at home. I can't afford a Tesla, and the Chinese cars haven't arrived yet. So, but I think it's coming. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Because we're nearly end of time, we're nearly 5:30. So I would like to take this opportunity to thanks all because from the history is beyond the classroom, and actually not only history but also future, also our conserve and preserve environmental politics and also environmental issues, and how through suggestion and comments given to solve our future's problem and issues. So I represent both the Institute and also our history sections for Universiti Sains Malaysia. Well, thanks all for attending today's this talk presented by Prof. David Dix, final talk by Prof. David. So a big applause to Prof. David. And we hope to see you. You could also give comments, suggestions through the website of Prof. David and email. Keep in touch with him. And we thank you very much for all. We hope to see you in the next event at Penang Institute. Thank you very much.
Can I just add one little thing? Again, I'm the tourist here. So if there are aspects of these stories or stories that you know that you want to share, I would love to get to receive those. Please don't be shy. Send me an email. These are the best kind of emails to receive versus usual work emails. So please do. And and thank you again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. See you then.